I am Dr. Lynn Paul, and I know most of you. A few of you I don't recognize, but hopefully you'll get to know me soon. Um, and I want to thank the NODCC one more time for fel funding this fellowship the last year um, to help us really get a foundation for moving forward with more research, as always. Um, And this is a research project, Ella, if you want to start, that we started over about 10 years ago, collecting information on infants and children and tracking them longitudinally to see what is the life experience, the current life experience. This is not an intervention. We're not doing any particular tests. We're gathering natural history. What is our group, our community's experience of getting the diagnosis, of the kind of challenges they face, the kind of interventions they get, et cetera. And we've been collecting this data for a long time. And this year, Ella has had the opportunity to spend a lot of time curating all of that information, getting it all synthesized, and beginning to analyze it. So she'll explain more about the different cohorts as we go along. This is an ongoing study, so if you're already in it, please keep doing your time points as they come up. And if you haven't enrolled, please do. It is very evident that people are really focused on this when their kids are little, and then life gets busy, and maybe your child's doing pretty well, or you're busy focusing on trying to help them, and we lose information. And so it's hard to be able to give families an idea of what's coming if we don't have a whole range of image of reference points of what this looks like. So Ellen, you want to go on? In this larger study, we do a bunch of standardized surveys and tests so that we can do them remotely, primarily, so people can do it online. For the infants up through age 3 or 4, there has also been a standardized parent interview that people have done every 6 months or once a year to get at developmental milestones. And then the natural history comes basically from these study specific questionnaires that we have generated and generated in collaboration with Dr. Warren Brown and Elliot Shear and Linda Richards, so that we're all gathering similar background information and in the long run can put it all together into one larger, even larger database and do even bigger samples analysis. So the goal here in general for a natural history is to give the baseline, to just describe the typical experience, like I said, what people with this diagnosis are having, experiencing um, clinically and just in life. Look at variations in time across the lifespan, and ultimately to start to break out and look at subgroups. Is there a difference between complete and partial or hypoplasia? And the reason we do it in a natural history context is we're just looking at what happens and trying to get clues that we can then follow up with other more controlled research studies down the line. So tonight, Ella's going to get into some of the more interesting things about behavior. And I think I'm going to turn it over to her.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lynn, for that introduction and for setting us up for the rest of this webinar. So, this is the fourth in a series of webinars throughout this fellowship of this natural history study. And I'm going to go to the next slide so that I can give you some time to look at these QR codes if you've missed the previous webinars. The first, a couple months ago, was the power of patient experience, talking about neuroanatomy and really going into a deep dive on what our study or what our participant sample looks like. Um, And the second webinar was pregnancy, birth, and medical history or medical issues, which again was really focusing on the very early portion of infant life and what that looks like with the DCC. And last month's webinar was talking about developmental milestones and intervention and treatment in general in the first about 5 years of life. And so if you haven't already, go check those out. And I'm going to go on to today's presentation, which is, sorry, I'm going to go through this a little bit. There we go. The fourth webinar, which is later childhood and the emergence of autism spectrum disorder and other diagnoses. So today's webinar will talk about neurodevelopmental disorders, diagnosed developmental delays, psychological disorders, sleep, and school. And so before I start, I want to introduce our sample. So I'm going to go back 2 slides. So for our participant sample for the overall natural history study, we have 489 participants who have filled out a full background and have given us all of the information we need to be in this study. So of those 489 participants, 311 of them have complete ACC, 67 have partial ACC, 50 have hypoplasia, and 62 have dysgenesis. And there are some further breakdowns here between isolated ACC and ACC plus, as you can see in these figures. And for more information on that, there's more information in the first 2 webinars. So if you're interested in diagnosis and brain formation, go look at those. But I wanted to talk about our participant sample specifically because we have 2 different samples that we're using throughout this natural history study. The first being, again, that 489 participants, and then our second group, which is what we're calling our verified diagnosis sample. And so these are participants within that 489 group that have submitted a postnatal MRI report or scan, and this is about 222 participants, or it is 222 participants. And the reason we ask for this verified diagnosis is so that we are able to accurately portray differences between group, for example, isolated and plus, as well as differences in diagnosis. So without that postnatal MRI report, we're not able to confidently say that differences between group and diagnosis are represented. So throughout this presentation, you'll see 2 different groups in the right-hand corner, which will look like these. So on the left, the yellow circle indicates that we used our full sample, and the blue circle indicates that we used the verified sample. And I'll talk a little bit more about these as we come across them. So first, I want to talk a little bit about sleep and problems with sleep within our participant. So out of the 488 people who answered our questions about sleep, 40% of them reported having sleep problems ever throughout their participation. Of that 40% of participants, or 193 participants, 15% of them reported having a specific sleep disorder. And of that 15%, or 29 participants, 79% of them reported having sleep apnea. So that came up quite a bit in the survey. And we didn't specifically ask for whether or not participants had sleep apnea. These are participants who offered that information. So this is not a comprehensive number of participants with sleep apnea, but this is the number that we're able to report. And just to put this into context a little bit, of all participants who reported sleep problems, so that 40% that I mentioned in the last slide, I wanted to compare it to the general population. So I found that up to 50% of children will experience a sleep problem in their childhood. So as you can see, our 40% is well within that normal range. And also looking at our sleep apnea group, obstructive sleep apnea occurs in 1 to 5% of children. So while it is on the higher end, our participants did not fall outside of the average range of uh, having sleep apnea. Um, and as I mentioned before, the way our survey is set up, we did not ask specific questions about types of sleep problems, but there is if you answer yes, then you're able to describe the sleep problems that your child is having. So I wanted to give a little bit of light to some of the things that were coming up throughout the survey. So um, of our 488 participants, 1% of them um, reported having sleep anxiety. And while it's not a large percentage, I wanted to bring it up because it came up several times and um, it was an experience that our participants were having. And again, of that larger group, 3% of participants reported having their child having night terrors. And again, to put that into context, sleep or night terrors occur in approximately 1 to 6.5% of children. So again, our participants seem to fall within that normal range. So overall, with our sleep findings, while participants are experiencing sleep problems, it seems that it's pretty much within the range of the general population. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about behavioral diagnoses. And I mentioned this in the last presentation, but I want to just briefly touch on again that these are diagnoses based on behavior and not physical anatomy. So to meet the criteria for these diagnoses, it is based on, again, behavior. So um, first, I wanted to talk about developmental delays. And A developmental delay is defined as a delay in meeting developmental milestones, so things like motor skills, social skills, language, adaptive functioning skills, a lot of the things we talked about in the previous presentation. Um, and I'm going to be talking about two types of developmental delays. The first is the global developmental delay, which is from a diagnosis between 0 and 5 years old. And also, we'll be talking about intellectual disability, and this is the classification of developmental delay for children 5 years and older. So, global developmental delay, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is classified as developmental delay in individuals younger than 5 years old. And the criteria we're using to define this for our participants is a no global developmental delay, or GDD, as I'll be using going forward. No to mild GDD is a mild delay in no more than two domains, or fewer than two domains. And a moderate to severe GDD is at least moderate delay in at least two domains. So domains being domains of development. And for the rest of this presentation, I will be using the moderate to severe GDD diagnosis as the general GDD diagnosis. And so the way we determined the GDD diagnosis for our participants is through the Vineland phone interview. And if you have ever been part of the infant study specifically, you're familiar with the phone call interview and questionnaire that we do. And if you're not, these are phone interview assessments, and we ask a lot of questions about development. And from this study, we are able to obtain a reliable scientific diagnosis for participants of developmental delay. Because the questions span all different aspects of development, we are able to determine within our criteria whether or not participants meet the criteria for a global developmental delay. And so for this next section, I'll be using the verified sample because I'll be talking about the difference between group and diagnosis. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, this is quite a smaller sample than before. So the percentages may be affected from that. But as you can see, with these two figures, on the left, we have global developmental delay by age in isolated DCC, and on the right, we have global developmental delay in DCC plus. by age as well. Um, and these are the time points at 12, 18, 24, and 36 months. Um, and as you can see, the isolated group is a bit lower on average for meeting that criteria, and the DCC plus group is a bit higher. But it is important to note also that the DCC plus group does have a smaller sample, so this could also have an effect on percentages. So next I'm going to introduce a couple of neurodevelopmental disorders that I'll be talking about throughout the presentation. Neurodevelopmental disorders are defined as disorders that begin in childhood that can affect development. And so today we'll be talking, or the three we'll be talking about today are autism spectrum disorder, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or ADHD. Um, and something also to note is that for these different disorders, there is an age range in which they are able to be diagnosed in children. So for autism spectrum disorder, diagnosis begins at 18 months, and this is the same for pervasive developmental disorder. Whereas ADHD, while it can be diagnosed before 5 years old, for this presentation, we will be using diagnosis only 5 years and older. In our sample, and so this will be using, again, the larger sample and not the verified sample. In our sample, 68% or 68 participants reported a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, which is 15% of the sample. And so I have this figure laid out by age, so we can see that this is over time by time point, and this is showing the percent of participants by time point that reported a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And it is quite a bit lower before age 5, and then it increases and peaks in the teenage years. And this can be affected by low participation in the teenage years because, as I've discussed in previous webinars, the teenage age range of our sample has lower participation than the younger range. So this could affect our percentages, but for today, we're seeing that it peaks in the teen years. This is also interesting to look at because we know that a third of adults with a DCC do meet criteria for an autism spectrum disorder. And so this is what we're seeing in the teen and tween ranges. They're at about that 33%. So next, I also want to talk a little bit about the overlap between global developmental delay, autism spectrum disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder. So for this figure, our age range is between 1 to 5 years old, and of our 165 participants who have data available, so this means that they uh, have have reported answers on all three of these diagnoses. 85% of participants qualify for a global developmental delay at some point in this age range. 10 of these participants also qualify for an ASD diagnosis, and 2 of these participants also have a PDD diagnosis. And so there's quite a bit of overlap in this age range between these 3 diagnoses. And next, I'll be talking about the other developmental delay diagnosis that I mentioned before, which is an intellectual disability. This diagnosis applies to individuals 5 years and older, and the criteria for this diagnosis is having an FSIQ of less than 70, but we do not ask for this information in our surveys, so we will be relying on self-report, as we do ask for information about intellectual disability within our survey. So this is quite a bit different from the other qualification of the developmental delay, which was global developmental delay. And it's different because this is a parent report diagnosis, whereas the global developmental delay, we're using um, tests to obtain the information. So it is different in the quality of diagnosis because we have varying levels of information between these two diagnoses. Um, and here we have a figure showing ID or intellectual disability by time points. And this is again divided by group and diagnosis. So on the left, we have isolated DCC, and on the right, we have DCC plus. And as you can see on the left, the isolated group has a higher percentage of ID diagnosis within the hypoplasia groups, which is a trend we've seen before in the previous webinar. That sometimes in the isolated groups, the hypoplasia group looks more similar to the plus group. Um, and this is not echoed in the plus groups where there is a higher percentage of complete ACC endorsement of intellectual disability. But it is also important to note that the sample difference between there is a sample difference between these two groups, as the isolated group is almost twice the number of the plus group. So this can also have an effect on the percentages. Looking now both at both types of developmental delay, GDD and ID. GDD has a 52% incidence rate in our sample, whereas ID only represents 32% of the sample. However, there are several things to take into account here. The ID group covers a larger age span, and also it's important to note, again, the type of categorization that we used for the two groups, leaving the opportunity that the GDD diagnosis could have been um, more thorough than the ID diagnosis. And now I want to talk a little bit about the overlap between ID, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD. First, the age range for this figure is 5 years and older, due to the ID and ADHD diagnosis age range. Of our 173 participants in this age range and that qualified to be in the sample, 56% of 56 participants report an ID, 54 report an ASD diagnosis, and 51 report a diagnosis of ADHD. And between these groups, there's a pretty even percentage between the three diagnoses, and there's also an even overlap between the three diagnoses, which is very interesting. And next, I'll be talking about the psychological disorders, these psychological disorders within our sample. And the disorders I'll be talking about today are depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, and schizophrenia. And for the first three, we are using diagnoses from 5 years or older, whereas childhood onset for schizophrenia begins at 13 years old, is the beginning of the diagnosis range. For depression, of the 171 participants who are in the age range, 11 or 6% have a diagnosis of depression. And this overall diagnosis rate is within the normal range for the general population, though it varies over time between 0.5 and 8.7% of children experience depression during this age range, and our 6% is within that range. And the highest rate of depression the highest rates are in the teen age range, which makes sense for the onset of this diagnosis. And it's important to note that, again, the teenage age range has a lower participation rate than the earlier years, so this could have an effect on the rate of diagnosis. One possible explanation is that parents of participants that have more severe symptoms or want more answers might be more inclined to look for research. So this could be one way that our sample uh, is represented the way that it is. So there are a lot of things to keep in mind when looking at this information. Um, and of the 172 participants who are in the diagnosis age range, 41 participants, or 24%, have a diagnosis of anxiety. And the overall diagnosis rate for our for our sample is higher than the normal range for the general population, which is between 2 to 3% to 16%. And so our 24% is quite a bit higher than that. Um, and there's current research being conducted on the overlap between anxiety and DCC, so we will have to wait and see the consensus on um, this outcome in adults. Um, but there can be difficulties experienced for people with a DCC that are more prevalent than individuals without a DCC. So it makes sense that they would experience higher rates of anxiety. Though this may not necessarily be an anxiety disorder, but rather higher rates of general anxiety. Um, and for our sample, and back to the figure, the highest rates of anxiety or diagnosis of anxiety are in the teen years, which again makes sense for the onset age of anxiety. Um, and again, I want to point out that the teenage age range does have a lower participation rate, which could again affect the percentage rate of diagnosis of anxiety. And so next we'll talk a little bit about OCD. And so of the 173 participants who are in this diagnosis age range, 7 participants or 4% have a diagnosis of OCD, which is a little bit higher, but not too much higher than the general population range of 1 to 3% of children. Um, and again, same caveats as before. The diagnosis is higher in that teen range, which again could be affected by the participation rate. And so lastly, with schizophrenia, of the 76 participants who are in this diagnosis age range, 1 participant reported a diagnosis of schizophrenia. But looking further at this, the participant reported this diagnosis at 14 years, but not at 15 or 16 years old. So it's unclear if this is an accurate diagnosis, which, um, yeah, so it's something to look further into. And I want to talk a little bit about overlap between ASD, depression, anxiety, and OCD, because as you can see here, there is quite a lot of overlap. And so of the 171 participants who were in the diagnosis age range, which is for this case 5 years and older, 53 participants have an autism diagnosis, 10 participants have a depression diagnosis, 40 have a diagnosis of anxiety, and 6 have a diagnosis of OCD. And as you can see here, there's quite a bit of overlap specifically between depression with other diagnoses and OCD and other diagnoses. And this makes sense because there are established core overlaps between depression and anxiety, and also anxiety and autism. So um, this is uh, this makes a lot of sense with what we're seeing with our sample. And I also want to highlight a little bit about behavioral medication. So within our sample, 8% or 15 people within our sample are taking an antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication. And these can treat things like mood dysregulation or low energy are things that our participants reported taking them for. And with ADHD medication, 23% of our sample reported taking an ADHD medication at some point during their participation, which is about 43 people. And this makes sense because 30% of our participants do have a diagnosis of ADHD, so this matches up with that. And the symptoms reported for taking this medication are things like lack of attention and hyperactivity. And so this last section we'll be talking about education and school programs. And so for each of these sections, we'll be talking about three different age ranges. And so the first age range is under 5, or participants that are in a preschool program. And so of the 132 participants that are in a preschool program, 107 of them are in report being in regular education programs, 43 report being in special education programs, and 31 report using resource assistance. And there's, again, quite a bit of overlap between these three, with the largest overlap being between all three: regular education, special education, and resource assistance. And so moving up to the next age range, which is 5 years to 11 years, so elementary school age. Of the 134 participants that are in a school program, 84 report being in regular education program, 73 report being in a special education program, and 73 participants report using resource assistance. And 6% or 6 of our participants report being in an honors program. And again, there's a lot of overlap between these, with the highest overlap being between, again, all three: regular, special, and resource assistance. And it's interesting to note that with our uh, participants that are in honors programs, they are also using resource assistance and special education. And of the 36 participants in a school program between 12 years and 17 years, and I want to note that this is a much smaller sample, about a quarter of the two previous samples, so this will look a little bit different due to sample size. But of these 36 participants, 25 are report being in a regular education program, 22 report being in a special education program, 21 report being using resource assistance, and 5 report being in an honors program. And again, there's quite a bit of overlap, with the largest overlap being between all three as the previous: special education, regular education, and resource assistance, and also between regular education with resource assistance. And so next we'll talk a little bit about school difficulties, and it'll be within the same three age ranges. So of the, again, 132 participants in a preschool program, so under 5 years, 60 of the participants report no difficulties in school. And the rest of the participants, 18% report only one difficulty, whereas 82% report multiple difficulties. Um, and so the most common difficulties reported are with processing, attention, and learning. Processing, attention, and impulse control. Um, and there is quite a lot of overlap between all of these difficulties. So the difficulties we'll be talking about, just to backtrack a little bit, are processing, attention, learning, behavior, and impulse control. And with the next age range, 5 to 11, the number of participants that report no school difficulties went down a little bit, with only 11% or 14 participants reporting no school difficulties. And the percentage of individuals reporting processing, attention, and learning difficulties increased. So they're all around 60 to 65% of the population, or of the, sample, with the largest overlap being between all of these difficulties. And of the individuals that reported difficulties, 8% report only one difficulty, and 92% reported multiple difficulties. So the reason for pointing this out is that it seems that when individuals are experiencing one difficulty in school, it's likely that they're also experiencing other difficulties. And with the third, or the last age range, so 12 to 17, of our 36 participants, all 36 reported some type of difficulty in school. So with the most common being processing, attention, and learning, which is now being reported as the most common. Um, with again a lot of overlap between all types of difficulties. And some other school difficulties that I wanted to report but had a hard time categorizing. Of these other school difficulties, a large percentage of people reported school anxiety for their child. And for these three age ranges, two participants in the preschool age range reported school anxiety. Six participants in the 5 to 11 year range reported school anxiety, and four participants in the 12 to 17-year range reported school anxiety. And the other school difficulties that were mentioned were many parents mentioned that their child um, has a type of developmental delay that is causing barriers to education. And of the preschool sample, seven participants reported that this is an issue for their child's, 11 participants in the middle range, and six participants in the 12 to 17-year range. And so, some takeaways for today. Um, the first is that 30 to 50% of our participants qualify for a diagnosis of a developmental delay at some point during their childhood. And it's also important to note that global developmental delay and intellectual disability have high overlap with neurodevelopmental disorders like autism, pervasive developmental disorder, and ADHD. The second takeaway is noting that sleep problems are within a normal range. So, um, while participants may experience sleep problems, it seems to be pretty much on track with the general population of typically developing children. And lastly, um, older age participants report difficulties with school and learning more often. And so, this also, I want to note that, again, the older age range of our participant sample does have lower participation than the earlier range. So, this can be, again, a reasoning for our older participants reporting these difficulties more often. And with that, I want to bring back this slide from the first webinar, talking about how important it is for participation of all types of individuals with a DCC, and how important that is to note that all ability and developmental levels are represented within our research and all time points. So I have been emphasizing this. Our older kids range, 10 and up, is pretty sparse within participation. And so I want to gently encourage anyone who this is applicable to participate in research. And yeah, and so I want to say some thanks to everyone on the DCC Lifespan Studies team, as well as thank you so much to the NADCC for supporting this fellowship. We are so grateful that this is finally, um, again, coming to fruition and we're able to share it with you all. And we're excited for the next step in this fellowship, which is the interactive community report, which there will be more information about soon. Um, and yeah, thank you again to anybody who has participated in our program. We really could not have done this without you. I know I say it every time, but it's true, and we're so appreciative of your time and energy because it is a lot of time and energy. And again, we're really grateful for all that you do. And here are some things to scan if you are interested in participating.
Thank you, Ella. Um, it's very fun to get to the point where we're looking at the more nuanced questions and the questions that really parents have so many concerns about. So it's been fun. I have to say, as a mentor, it's been fun to watch Ella get increasingly excited as we go through this project and the amount of time and energy she has spent doing this is so far beyond whatever we could have planned or what she was actually budgeted for. Uh, but that's the way things go. And she really took a hold of it and has fully embraced and is invested in this group of kids and this condition. And so thank you to Ella for giving so much more, so going above and beyond to ensure that what you're doing is quality work. And that is, I appreciate that tremendously. Uh, so thank you and bravo. More to
Thank
come
you.
from her over the years ahead.
Yes, thank you, Ella, so much for putting all this together. I know it was a lot of work and pulling all the information down and making it easy for families to understand, because often papers are written and it's very difficult to understand. So this is great. I can't wait to see what comes out of that. This on top of what you've presented the last four webinars. There was a question for a child who could operate in regular or special ed programs, which would be most beneficial for outcomes, any trends for increased needs over time?
I will step in and comment on that from my work and assessment with kids through uh, school age. I think the most important thing well, there are a couple things. You want to really to make sure that whatever basic skills your child is learning, they learn it well. And if something like reading, which is critical for all future educational success, if they start to show delays in that, then getting extra help for reading is critical, because if they don't really master it, by fourth, fifth grade, they're going to be expected to be able to read in order to learn content. And if every reading exercise is simply a reading exercise, not a content learning exercise, it's defeating the purpose of them being in that regular classroom. So through elementary school, I would encourage you to get an evaluation, a cognitive evaluation, ideally a neuropsych evaluation every 2 years. Depending on how the child's doing, if it's very clear they're very delayed, then maybe you don't need to do it quite as frequently. But you want to be able to see, are we sliding back at all? Are they staying at grade level? And what aspects of learning are starting to slide, so you can really bolster those and support them. One of the concerns I've heard parents say is, my child's socially doing well in elementary school or is engaged and feels like they're a part of things, and I hate to pull them out and put them in a special school. But by fifth grade, if they are starting to lag, especially if they're lagging by a year or two academically, the implications of that for their self-esteem, for their social skills, for everything else coming is going to get increasingly expansive. It's, the implications of a little delay grow as years go by. So it's better to take that moment, get them extra help, put them in the resource classroom or special ed if needed, so that they bolster those skills and can start to have some success if they're not having it, which is important as well. So it's a long-winded answer. I think it's always going to depend on your child, and it's important to get those assessments. There's not a one size fits all.
What age do you suggest that they get their first assessment by?
If a child is starting to show developmental delays, like they're missing milestones, then I would get a cognitive assessment or a developmental assessment before age 5. If they're keeping up somewhat and they're getting occupational, physical therapy, etc., then my recommendation is before they enter school, you're focusing on emotion regulation, endurance, the things that are going to set them up to do okay in school, to manage their behavior. And then if they're showing any delays once they start school, I would get a cognitive evaluation at 6. Before then, the evaluation is more developmental, and that's what Ella was talking about in a developmental delay diagnosis, is saying they're falling behind, but we don't know yet, is it they're going to be behind in everything, or is there going to be an intellectual disability, or a lot of these kids will be on target and not have a global developmental delay, but start to have educational delays by 10, 11, or 12. And so as far as cognitive evaluations, I would say 2nd, 4th, 6th grade, right at 9th grade when they go into high school, right as they're finishing high school, so that you have a good evaluation of where they're at and come up with a solid transition plan. And then if they're in college or not, either way, early 20s is another good point because they're continuing to grow cognitively and behaviorally. And if you can get a good evaluation again in their early 20s, you'll have a better idea of where they've cognitively landed, and you'll have hopefully get more of their buy-in to take ownership of whatever lingering challenges there are. So yeah, I would say 2nd, 4th, 6th, 9th, 12th. Yeah.
And then, so another question that people might have is it done by the school or is this private?
It really is going to vary depending on the quality of your school system, and the educational evaluations. If your child has more complications, it may be that you want to get a neuropsych assessment at least at one point in elementary school. The difference is a neuropsychological evaluation is really thinking much more in terms of systems of cognitive processing and how it relates to the anatomy and how things are explained by the corpus callosum disorder, or might indicate some other complication. Whereas most school evaluations are really just looking at school skills and how are they doing, and they're not going to give you the same level of interpretation. So at least at some point along the way, yes, get one good neuropsych evaluation would be my recommendation. Now, if your child's nonverbal, that's a lot harder all the way around, as Barbara will attest.
Yes. We were very fortunate. Our school district paid for our first neuropsych outside of the school district because they were not capable of doing a nonverbal neuropsych eval. And I think he was 4 when we did it, 5. And our insurance actually paid for another one when he was 9. So.
And you're in a location where we could find somebody who could do it.
Correct. We live in an area where they're readily available. And hopefully everybody lives by a good or decent children's hospital, or can travel to a really good children's hospital. That's where we did our second one. So.
And the other thing you can do is you can reach out to me, and we can problem solve. If I know somebody in your area and they can do an evaluation and I can give you some consultation. If you've already had an evaluation, sometimes I'll take scores and look at them and give you an interpretation from the point of view of the ACC. We are continuing to train people in our clinical psych programs. So we'll hopefully have more and more people that understand ACC, but it's still a pretty limited number of professionals who do this work. So, one other thing I wanted to comment on, which was really interesting to see, is that shift in elementary school that you start to see more anxiety because they're running into some trouble. And a lot of times through elementary school, you'll feel like my child keeps getting different diagnoses. They keep behaviorally labeling them as this or that or the other. And it depends on what are the most prominent concerns at the time, what's the bias of that evaluator, and the fact that a lot of times kids with ACC don't fit a behavioral diagnosis just in the pocket perfectly. The behavioral diagnosis is describing the behavioral constellation so that you can get services, so that other professionals can understand the behavior patterns and know what to expect. It's meaningful, but it may always feel a little bit like, we don't quite fit. We're a little bit of a square peg in a round hole. And that may be why it'll be an OCD diagnosis. And then somebody says, no, I think it's ASD. The compulsivity is part of that. And a lot of this it's an art as much as science, especially for these kids who their behavioral challenges may be rooted in multiple layers of complications. A child may have had attentional deficit disorder regardless of if they had ACC. That may be a family trait. And then you add on the ACC and it gets kind of a different flavor. So things that complicate the process.
Often I think that the professionals don't know a lot about a disorder of the corpus callosum, and because they
Mhm.
don't, they're going for those easy labels because they can identify it and put a name to it. And then of course that comes with services. Um,
Well, but I want to clarify, it's not that those are the easy labels, those are the behavioral
the
labels.
behavioral labels, exactly.
So the ACC doesn't describe the behavior.
Mhm.
It doesn't give you information. And so what they're trying to do is describe the behavior in a way that is meaningful to the people that do intervention.
Mhm.
Um,
That makes sense.
so ASD may fit
Mhm.
into the description of the challenges the child's having. And so that diagnosis does apply. It's not that it isn't ASD, it's just ASD with a different, maybe some different neurological causes. If that makes sense.
We could talk about this forever. So,
Yeah. And we're continuing to study it forever. One of the other things that has been really important in our work is it had been clear that we were hitting this about 30% meet the ASD social deficit criteria by adolescence and older. We weren't sure if it would start to express itself young. And as Ella showed, you are getting some kids that are showing up with that by 2, 3 years, and there's some preliminary symptoms, but it does continue to increase. And so I recently was contacted by a family who said, you told us a couple years ago what might happen. And we pulled open the email. The child's now 12. And we're like, oh, yeah, this is exactly what was going to happen. Even in the really smart kids, the challenges start to emerge. It's a unique profile in that way. Thank you, Ella. I know we're at the end of the time, but really appreciate all your work.
yes,
And
definitely.
and I love hearing the stories from everybody because your stories are really what the research has been rooted in. Often families have asked, what are your research questions? And that's part of why we love conferences. We watch and we listen and we walk away with more research questions based on what you're describing. So this is a formal natural history, but natural history is what Warren and Elliot and Linda and I have rooted our work on from the beginning.